I hit the go button on this thing, and then I forgot I was wearing this hilarious shirt, which I think I wore last week also. What can I say? I'm a party animal. Yeah, I know. What's happening, everybody? Welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I am your host, Dan Bespris, and today I had initially promised that we were going to be diving into NBA draft stuff, but I thought it through, and for a couple of reasons. Number one is scheduling wise, but also I think there's a certain value in actually kind of stringing it together. So, what I'm going to do instead is we're going to have a draft show tomorrow with Kyle Irving. We'll tape that today, and it'll air tomorrow for you guys. We'll tape the Noah Rubin show, and that'll air on Friday. And then we'll have a show with my good friend David Williams, who you guys may remember. He was on a number of our fantasy shows over the years. He's been on our he was one of the hosts of our trade deadline show for a number of years in a row. He's also the host of the Grizzlies show over on the Sports Ethos Network. And just in time, I have a crying youth, so we're going to check on that. What's going on, man? Okay, well, that was something. I guess he's okay. You guys saw he seems to be hurt, but he didn't tell me what was going on. So anyway, hopefully Asher's all right. As I was saying, we're gonna get David Williams on the show. We'll record that. Now I'm gonna have to do some editing on this stuff. Anyway, as I was saying, we're going to David Williams on the show. We'll probably record that one at the end of this week. That'll air either over the weekend or first thing next week. Hoping to get my good buddy Josh Lloyd on the program before the draft begins. And I mean, I swear to God, what do we got going on here? Serenity now. I don't know if you guys know this, but today's a holiday. Worst start to a video cast ever. Okay, so as I was saying, run 3 here. Kyle Irving tomorrow, Noah Rubin Friday, David Williams first thing next week, Josh Lloyd likely next week, and then it's draft time. Okay, we got through that. Today, instead of doing draft stuff, because this allows us, if we waited, talking to Kyle at like 3, 4 this afternoon, we wouldn't have a show out until after that when it all got sort of edited together. I thought it might be more fun to just get a show going today, string all the draft stuff together over the next few shows as it is, and roll right into it next week. So thank you to all those guests in advance. Thank you to you guys for sitting through this very unusual opening to a podcast. Now we can do stuff. So, hi, at Dan Bespris over on Twitter. If you want to give me a follow, please do check out at Old Man Squad over on Twitter. I'm going to do follow backs from that account. So if you guys follow the Old Man Squad Twitter account, I'll follow you back. How's that? You want an extra follow out of it? You get one. At Old Man Squad. Go check that out. I'm not going to do it from the Dan Bespris one because that one I need to make sure my feed is perfectly culled to have exclusively NBA stuff. But Old Man Squad, I got nothing to lose there. I just want you guys to follow it so you can see all the cool stuff we got going on through this network. Today, we're going to talk about the best and worst rounds in the fantasy draft from this past season. And the way we're going to do that is with the Yahoo comparison page that I put up last week. This is that Excel file. There you go. We can see that on the screen. I think that's about as large as it's going to get, so hopefully it'll work for you guys. Last week, you might remember we went through on the total side and on the per game side, basically the winners from this past year and what we could learn from them. Today, and those that are watching can see over on the far right side of the screen, I've color-coded basically every end of round difference. I get it. It's hard to see on the screen, so just follow with me here. I'm gonna talk through this like you guys can't actually see any of what I'm talking about. I have on this board a number of columns. There's like 10 or 11 columns. The starting ADP, their final ranking on a per game basis. That's what this final, I should really write this as not final average, but final per game ranking. And now it's gone off the board. So you guys get to walk with me here. And then the rest of this stuff is different things. So average per 10, basically how the final ranking is averaging on a running 5 slot basis, kind of a lagging indicator a bit. Difference, the absolute value of that, the running sum, the live average of that running sum, the absolute value sum, the live running average of the absolute value. And then where we're going to look at today is the per 10 and the absolute value per 10. I think most of you probably know what an absolute value is, but just very quickly, an absolute value is the positive separation between two numbers. So it doesn't care which direction it's going. It's just the measurement of that distance. So basically, like, to use a real life example of this, if I'm standing in the middle and this direction is the positive direction and this direction is the negative direction, somebody to this side of me is, plus 5 steps away, and somebody to this side is negative 5 steps. So everything's moving this way. The absolute value is simply the measurement of the distance from me to those things. So it's 5 either way. For fantasy purposes and the way we look at it on the draft board, it's okay. It doesn't care if the miss was a good miss or a bad miss. So, this year, Tyrese Maxey was whatever the hell he was. He was a positive. Where did he go here? Tyrese Maxey had an ADP of 57, and he finished at 21. So he's a positive 36. On the flip side, Paolo Banchero had an ADP of 59, finished at 158. He was a negative 99. The absolute value of that, Tyrese Maxey, it's still 36. For Banchero, it's now positive 99 because it missed by 99 slots. Absolute value just doesn't care which direction it misses by. What that does for us here as we go through these numbers, and I know we're getting into sort of the true nerdery of it before we even talk about any actual fantasy stuff, is, and those that are watching can see these two numbers over here on the far right side, which is the per 10. So a running tally of how the picks are going on a per 10, basically the sum of it, and the absolute value of that. The disparity between those two covers up a possible round where there might be almost like an equal number of misses in the positive and negative direction that cancel each other out, which might look like a very accurate round, but in actuality, it was just a bunch of misses that were big in opposite directions. What you want is a low absolute value miss distance to find out what the best rounds were. And it's going to be sort of a graded on a curve a bit here, because the farther down the board you get, the farther you can miss by in either direction. So it's much harder to have a low absolute value number the farther you get down the board, meaning if you can get one, that's a really successful round. So let's just start off. Let's look at the first round, and you guys can kind of see how this goes, and that'll help us figure out what the best opportunities were. The first round, at the end of 10, not round, we're going to do it by 10s because it's just easier to do the math. The end of the first 10, call it a 10-team league, then we can call it rounds. Damian Lillard was the 10th ADP, and after 10, the live sum was negative 71. 8 out of the 10 picks were in the negative direction. Joel Embiid was a +2. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was a +3. And that is going to be kind of the MO of the first round, because it's really hard to miss in the positive direction when you're drafting a guy at like 6. There's only 5 slots he could miss upward into, and there's basically an infinite number of slots he could miss down. But at the same time, so the per 10, by the way, was negative 7.1 because the live sum was negative 71. You just divide that by 10. Absolute value sum was 81. So the per 10 there was 8.1. Those numbers are close, which shouldn't surprise anybody because there were very few misses in opposite directions. They were pretty much all misses to the negative. But as you guys will see here, as I flip through it, I didn't color code these. Last year, the first round, the per 10 was negative 3.5. Sorry, that's 2 years ago. I lost last year's in the great computer fire of July 2023. The previous year, at the end of the first round, was terrible, actually. The per 10 was negative 18.7, mostly because you had a Doncic giant miss, and Anthony Davis medium-sized miss. Trae Young and Devin Booker were disastrous misses in the first round of that year, so that one was particularly bad. 2019, 2020, I think this was before I started doing totals, negative 5.6 was per. Absolute value was 6.4. 2018, 2019 was negative 4.7 and 4.9. And I forgot how I had built this differently here. I don't remember what the hell this meant. That was the first year I did it, and then I don't think I did the calculations there. All that to say that negative 7.1 is not very good for a first round. I didn't do the total side, but it's bigger. It's not the end of the world. It didn't have multiple colossal misses in the first round, the way that you saw, whatever that was, 2020 to 2021. But you had Giannis, who was a pretty good size per game miss, thanks to mostly free throw stuff. Steph Curry was a 15 slot miss. Tatum was 11. Damian Lillard was 15 also. You don't usually have quite that many double-digit misses in the first 10. So I marked the first round as a light red this year because I thought it was one of the poorer first rounds from an ADP standpoint we've had over the last 6-ish years or so. All that to say, I don't think the first round was one of the good ones. Second round, as per usual, was ugly. At the end of 20 picks, the last 10, JJJ was that last guy there. Running total, not absolute value, sum, basically the average over the last 10, was negative 15. Bad. Only 3 winners in that second group of 10 and 6 losers and 1 neutral. Devin Booker was exactly dead heat. So again, it could have been a lot worse, but it wasn't very good. So I made that a slightly darker red. And, the numbers bear it out. First round only had 2 what you'd call winners, and you had 4 or 5 guys that were kind of like they did all right. Second round, the winners, which is still relatively hard to get, Donovan Mitchell, Anthony Davis, Kyrie Irving, but some pretty big losers. Mikal Bridges was a bad one. Jaren Jackson Jr. was a bad one. Trae Young, Anthony Edwards. Sorry, Domantas Sabonis. You were very good by totals. LaMelo Ball. These guys were all double-digit losers. In fact, there wasn't a single-digit loser in the second round from a per-game standpoint. So the misses were big. The hits were smallish. And so you ended up with a second round that wasn't particularly good. Disasters could be avoided in the 11 through 18 clump, but 19 and 20 turned out to be kind of unpleasant. But now we have our first candidate for best round of the year. The third round. And you guys might remember from talking about it late last week. In the third round, we had 6 guys that beat their ADP. LeBron, Wembanyama, Lauri Markkanen, Kawhi Leonard, Freddie VanVleet, and James Harden. You only had 1 what I'd call big loser in the third round. That was Pascal Siakam, who had an ADP of 29. He finished at 79. By the way, congrats to Pascal for signing I think it was a max extension with Indy, 4-year, well-paid. We'll call it a well-paid extension. So the nice thing here is that you had these kind of medium-sized winners that basically canceled out with the small to medium-sized losers. And honestly, without Pascal Siakam, you end up with actually winners. In fact, we could scroll just a tiny bit further here on the board. You can see the running 10 from pick 31, 32, and 33 was actually in the positive direction. You almost never see that happen, where you have that many hits in one small clump. So from LeBron James, who had an ADP of 23, to Bam Adebayo, basically, who had an ADP of 32. That's 10. That's 10 picks there. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hits. Siakam being the big loss, Adebayo, medium loss, and then Jimmy Butler, who was basically like almost right on. Pretty amazing, actually. In fact, and I didn't look at this before we started the broadcast, but I'll look at it now. I don't think that there was ever a time, during this last one, you got close. Last year at pick 65, you had like a handful of winners in a row in there. But the losers were also so gigantic that it wiped it out. And let's see. Let's go back to 2020. Were there any spots where the per 10 was a positive? Yes. Is that actually possible here? Yeah, there was one. Literally one. And instead here, we had 3 in a row. And early on, too, which is also difficult to do because, again, there are more distances you can cover on the missing side than you can on the making side. It's wild. Let's keep moving. You guys don't want me to slow down too much. End of this fourth chunk of 10, negative 15.7 on the per absolute value. Oh, I didn't talk about the absolute value of that last one. So the absolute value in the third round was 15.8. And of course, the problem there is, yes, you got a little bit of the like misses and makes canceling each other out. 15.8 is not bad for the absolute value at that juncture, but it's not good either. So I mean, it's basically a neutral. Fourth chunk, not great. Negative 15.7 on the regular, 25.1 on absolute value, because now you're starting to get into some of the bigger misses in either direction. There were only 4 hits in this group. We already talked about Paul George, Jalen Brunson, De'Aaron Fox, and Jamal Murray were the other ones. But you had effectively 5 kind of ugly misses, and then DeJounte Murray, who was pretty close. But Adebayo, medium-size miss. Miles Turner, medium-size negative. And then Cade, Jaylen Brown, and Darius Garland were all very bad picks. So this one ended up not great. Fifth chunk of 10, and we're trying to move fast. I think today's podcast we can do in about 25 minutes, and then again we'll segue into some NBA draft stuff starting tomorrow. Fifth chunk of 10, because I do want to also leave time for a little bit of kind of wrap up here. This group had 5 hits. 3 of them were really good ones. Porzingis, Chet Holmgren, Scotty Barnes were all in this group. The misses, Jordan Poole was the colossal one. Zach LaVine, obviously, on the total side was much worse, but per game, he was kind of a medium miss. Drew Holiday was a medium miss. And then you had Mobley, Vooch, who were pretty damn close. In fact, Mobley was a dead hit, 41-41, ADP and final ranking. And DeAndre Ayton was kind of a small win. DeMar DeRozan was sort of a medium win also. So this is another one, and this is hard to do, by the way. Negative 5.1 was the sum. 26.9 was the absolute value, which again, not great, not horrendous. But you once again had this example of having a handful of hits canceling out with a handful of misses. If you're like, Dan, you're being very kind to these so far. Well, that's because we really haven't gotten to the ugly ones yet. But now we have. ADP 51 through 60 was a train wreck this year. Tyrese Maxey was a nice hit. Jared Allen was a medium-sized hit. And everybody else was god-awful. Nick Claxton being the smallest miss of the bunch of just a negative 15, but Anunoby, negative 26, Kessler, negative 29, Ingram, negative 30, Zion, minus 54, Randall, minus 74, Giddey, Banchero. The running per 10 here was negative 36. The average miss size in this 51 to 60 range was you ended up getting yourself basically an 8th rounder. Yikes, absolute value of 46. So, yeah, nothing else there. Next chunk was, this one was fun because there were only 3 hits in the 61 to 70 range. Jalen Williams, Brook Lopez were the pretty good ones. Rudy Gobert was a slightly smaller one. But there really weren't, but for one, Cam Johnson was the only one. There really weren't any colossal anythings in this round on the per game side. Şengün was a 0. Devin Vassell was a 0. Those guys, a 0 meaning they had the exact same ADP as they had final per game ranking. Franz Wagner was only off by 4. And then you had a couple of dudes in the 20s. So on this one, not only did you have a small running 10 on the sum side at negative 6.7, the absolute value miss size was only 18 in this group. That's incredibly impressive. That's basically, I think that's the third smallest that we've had so far when you're in a range where the miss size could be truly monstrous. And it'll get there. So what did we learn from that? Well, let's loop back around and we'll cover that at the end. I want to get through these last 3 chunks before we try to read into it too much. 71 to 80 had 3 hits, but a lot of pretty good size misses. None of the like completely game ending type of misses. That's why the miss size was only negative 19. I'm actually calling that a very small, decent round in terms of like, look, you got guys that were probably relatively close to where you drafted them. Absolute value was at 30, so not quite as good. 81 through 90 was a very successful group for whatever reason. Derek White, monster hit. Tobias Harris, CJ McCollum, pretty damn big size hits. And Michael Porter Jr., kind of a small one. Jabari Smith Jr., Austin Reeves were very close to their ADP. And then you had Marcus Smart, Chris Middleton, small negatives. And Buddy Hield was the only kind of bad one in that group. So this one had a miss size of only negative 5.8. Absolute value of 37. So not great there because the misses and makes kind of canceled each other out a little bit. But it is worth pointing out that as you get to that, this is a group again where you started to see the miss size trend into the positive. Derek White pushed it into the positive because of the size of his hit was a big reason why. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Over the 10 picks from Terry Rozier to Derek White, you had 5 out of 10 winners, and the winners were bigger than the losers there. And it happened again from Tobias Harris ranging back to Kyle Kuzma. The winners were simply bigger than the losers, even though there were only 4 winners and 6 losers in that stretch. And then the last group, Mark Williams to John Collins, 91 to 100, was real bad. You had 4 winners, and they were okay. Mark Williams being a winner here who didn't play for most of the season, but D'Angelo Russell, Jalen Duren, John Collins. But the misses were massive. Now you're getting into the really big ones. Real big ones. Markelle Fultz, minus 178. Scoot, negative 237. Mitchell Robinson, negative 91. There were some big, big misses in there, and you can see it on the screen. Negative 42 on the per game sum side and 63 absolute value. Okay, so those are the numbers. That's the raw data. But what does it actually mean for us on the fantasy basketball side? Is there anything that we can actually do with this stuff as we go forward? The answer there, unfortunately, is a very, very soft yes. Because every year it's different, as we just talked about. Now, again, I lost last year's data, but we just looked at the previous year. And, 2021, 2022, first round was good. Second round actually wasn't that big of a mess. Wasn't great, but it wasn't the end of the world. Third round was terrible that year. Fourth was meh. Fifth was also meh. Sixth round was like surprisingly successful. There were a lot of really good picks in the 51 to 60 range that year. So it doesn't match up all that great. Although, oddly enough, 81 to 90 actually wasn't bad that year either. But, we just went through a season where the first and second rounds weren't as good as usual. The third round was great. 2 seasons back, the third round was horrible. So this stuff doesn't really trend year over year. And if you look back at the third round from 2 years ago, you're like, oh, yeah. Because, okay, Donovan Mitchell, Freddie VanVleet, LaMelo Ball, Rudy Gobert, Devin Booker actually were all pretty big hits. Russell Westbrook was the worst pick of the draft. Michael Porter Jr. played like a week and then missed the whole season. Julius Randle was going in the third round. These guys finished at 250 or later, and then 126. And then DeAndre Ayton and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander were both sort of fine. So in reality, I would argue that 6, maybe even 7 of those guys in the third round were extraordinarily accurate 2 years ago. And then 3 of them were the dumpster fires of the entire draft. How does that parallel to what we got this season around? Well, That's why we have the absolute value, because this year, negative 1.7 was the sum, 15.8 was the absolute value. 2 years ago, we just talked about it, that third round, negative 55.3 was the sum, 58.1 was the absolute value, meaning there wasn't a big gap between them. That tells you that it wasn't about missing in two different directions. That tells you that there was something else going on there. Does this mean that the third round is just a magical place where everything works? Hell no. Because the year before that, the third round was basically across the board terrible. John Collins was a miss. Russ was a miss. Donovan Mitchell was a miss. Ben Simmons was a miss. John Morant was a miss. Shea was bad that year, believe it or not. And they were big, substantial misses. Unfortunately, there is no obvious pattern. So what we can do with this information, and why I wanted to spend a show on it, was number one, just because it's kind of fun to look at numbers. And I don't know, you guys might like numbers also. I like numbers. But more than that, it's about analyzing the board on a year-to-year basis. And maybe this is the more important part, it's about figuring out where you can start to really take your shots. Because as bad as the second round is on a year-to-year basis, it's not necessarily better to take a guy in the third round. This year it was. That's what this average per 5 column is going to tell you guys. Is it better to take a third rounder over a second rounder? This year, yeah. Third rounders, by average, finished higher than the second rounders by a round. But then it drops off, as you'd expect it would, pretty much linearly. What about 2 years ago? Same thing? Well, first round, 6.8. Second round, 28.2. Third round, 140.6. My God. It's still pretty linear. And you get these odd rounds where it bounces up a little bit. As we mentioned a couple years ago, that 51 through 60 was kind of anomalous. But for the most part, it bounces, it moves. I should say it doesn't bounce around. It's fairly linear. So when you go into a fantasy draft, and I don't mean to contradict anyone that either has been on the show over the last 6-7 years or will be coming up. Because remember, we're doing a lot of guest stuff. That's one of the big pieces of this new Old Man Squad fantasy basketball show. I don't mean to contradict anyone who says, go get your guy. But in actuality, going and quote unquote getting your guy is not a winning strategy because it's pretty linear. Again, it's not perfect. Changes year over year. This year, third round was better than the second. But that doesn't mean next year in the second round, you should go draft a bunch of guys from the third round because, as we just looked at last few years, it pretty much just gets higher. And then at some point kind of levels off a little bit. Let's see where it leveled off this year. Leveled off around pick 60. Basically, everybody here's the average per 5. And you guys can see it. I know I'm scrolling kind of fast, but let's see. Where does it hit 60? Hit 60 here. That's Jordan Poole. Comes down back a little bit. And, okay, 80. I think 80 is probably the marker here. So it jumps up above 80 at Zion. That's pick 55. And then it pretty much hovers between 95, call it 100, and 60-something until about pick 90. So if you want to know where no man's land is, that's probably the real answer to this. Otherwise, it's pretty linear. See, there you go. 20 at the end of the first, 40 at the end of the second, 29 at the end of the third, then it jumps up to 50, then 59, and I get it. It's going to sine wave a little bit there. And look, in the middle of the second round, it drops back down to 14 for a couple of picks. It's pretty linear. And when it's pretty linear, when the line, and we'll do it this way so it's more accurate on your screen, when the line is doing this, and yes, obviously you're going to have this up and down thing, but the best fit is still coming through it, that's still telling you, for the most part, early in your draft, stay somewhat close to the draft board you see in front of you. Stay somewhat close to the ADPs listed. Not perfectly. You can fluctuate a bit on either side. If you have pick 18, you could take the guy at like 25, but don't take the guy at like 45. Because odds are the guys with the earlier ADPs usually, most of the time, almost all of the time, finish earlier than the guys with later ones. That, to me, more than anything else, is the lesson from this board where we're looking through, okay, how did each round do? How is the absolute value doing? How is the average over the last 5 doing? The lesson to take away from this particular show title, show topic, which rounds were the best? The best rounds basically go from top to bottom. And anything you find in between, which again, we did find some good rounds mixed in there, like the third round was particularly good this year. Okay. Was it 41 to 50? Yeah, 41 to 50 was a pretty good round this year. But again, still relatively linear in terms of where they finished. 61 through 70 was a relatively good round in terms of finding decent values, but they still mostly finished later than the rounds in front of them. Does that make sense? Maybe not. It's a little bit of a confusing topic, but as we start to see boards develop this year in presumably late July, early August, we'll be able to look at them and say, okay, look, good example from this board we're looking at right now. You had Brooke Lopez, Jalen Williams, Rudy Gobert. Remember, we talked about this a few minutes ago in the 61 to 70 range. You had some small misses in that range as well. Great. That was a relatively accurate round for ADPs, but the guys still finished over those spots, basically from like 59 to 85 or so, for the most part. You can see 59 here, 85 there. That's basically where they were finishing up. And if you go 2 rounds earlier, they basically finished somewhere between 39 and 65, an earlier window. Even if you want to go in the 31 to 40 range, which was not a particularly accurate round. I mean, it wasn't bad. That one's still 28 to 50, roughly. Even inaccurate earlier rounds still, for the most part, have guys that finish earlier than more accurate later rounds. Actually, a super inaccurate later round might have more guys that finished way up the board. Like 81 through 90 here, you had 3 really big winners in a fairly accurate round. And yet, as a group, that round was still mostly finishing later than a couple rounds before it. It's so hard to go reaching way down the board and win until you get to about, and this is the no man's land thing, until you get to about pick 65, somewhere in this range. Suddenly now, this running average of per 5 bounces between 65 and 110 for about the next 30 picks. And there isn't really, it's almost actually like the best fit line from 1 to 65 kind of goes like this. And then at 65, it kind of just flattens out and does a wave. And then after you get to about 95, boom, horrible accuracy. Grab whoever you want at that point. So 1 through 65, try to stay somewhat within striking distance of the board, especially because that's how you're going to game theory your way to the guys you actually want. 60 or 65, somewhere in that range to about 90, 95. That whole window, basically, guys, you can grab. So reach 30 if you want to. After 95, doesn't matter. Now you're shooting. You're just firing. Whatever. There's going to be, 2 handfuls of players total after that have decent fantasy value. So good luck to you. It's going to be, again, like 1 out of every 8 or 9 picks. All right, so there's a lot of numbers today. I'll admit that. There was a crying child and a lot of numbers on today's podcast. This was a fits and starts one. And by the way, remember I said they're not all going to be video shows? Today probably would have been a good day for me to not do a video show because kids are home. It's Juneteenth. There's no school, no camp. We got run-ins. He seems to be fine, though. The text message from the other room is that they're fine and they're hungry. So Yes, I better deal with that. I'm Dan Vespers for the Old Man Squad Sports Network. Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. Again, at Old Man Squad on Twitter. I will follow back. And if you already followed it, let me know so I can follow you back there as well. At Dan Vespers, that's me. Tomorrow, we're going to start our NBA draft excursion, which should, I hope, last 4 or 5 shows. And then you actually got your draft, and then we don't have to really talk about it anymore. Not for a while, at least. Because at that point, once the draft is over, we're just a handful of days away from free agency. Yes! Can you feel that, buddy? Huh? Have a great Wednesday, everybody. It's Wednesday, right? Yeah. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. I don't know. I'm a lost cause. See you tomorrow.